Zero. That's the number of stories from right-leaning outlets that made it into Apple's top news spots in all of January 2026. Zero out of more than 600.
It's a statistic that really just stops you in your tracks. I mean, it completely reframes how you might think about the news you get every single morning.
And that's what we're doing today, mapping the territory of this new kind of superpower. Because if you look at Apple in 2026, the label big tech just feels, I don't know, too small.
Way too small.
They're negotiating with governments on tariffs, they're policing a digital border through the App Store, and they're managing a population of employees bigger than some small countries.
So we're really looking at a geopolitical player, kind of a state within a state.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how that state really operates.
Mm.
We've got a stack of documents here that, honestly, they paint a very contradictory picture.
Mm-hmm.
We have this new study on their, let's call it their Ministry of Information, Apple News, which shows that startling lockout of conservative voices.
Right. And then we have what you could call their Supreme Court treaty. That's their amicus brief on immigration.
And then the trade-offs.
Yeah.
The quiet removal of the ICEBlock app, which seems to be a move to appease the Trump administration.
It's a whole web. They're an editorial gatekeeper, a corporate activist, and a business just trying to survive a trade war, all at the same time.
So, okay, let's start with that Ministry of Information. I went deep into this Media Research Center study, the MRC study, from January 2026. And they didn't just look at random articles. They focused on the top stories slot.
Which is prime real estate.
Oh, absolutely. It's the first thing millions of people see when they unlock their phone.
Right. The influence there is just, it's massive. And the breakdown is what's so fascinating. They analyzed, what was it, 620 stories?
620 stories over the whole month. And the data is just, it's brutal. So of those 620 stories, a full 440 came from left-leaning outlets, the Washington Post, NBC News, The Guardian, that sort of thing. Then you have 180 from sources the study calls centrist, but the right-leaning column, the New York Post, Fox News, the Washington Times, it wasn't just low, it was empty. Zero.
So it's the zero that changes everything. You might expect some bias, right? Maybe a 60-40 split or, even 70-30, but total exclusion, that suggests there's a structural filter at play.
And that's exactly what Dan Schneider from the MRC is getting at in these notes. He calls it subliminal propaganda.
Wow.
His point is that because you, the user, don't see the mechanism, you don't see an editor physically choosing the story, you assume it's neutral. You think, oh, this is just what's important in the world today.
Yeah.
But the data suggests it's a highly curated, very filtered reality.
But we have to be fair and look at Apple's side of this because they've been very vocal about why they do this.
Right.
Lauren Hearn, their editor-in-chief, has argued for years that this is about quality, not politics.
Right. The human curation argument. I went through the transcripts of their interviews. Their whole pitch is that algorithms, the stuff you see on Facebook or X, that they drive people to crazy land.
Crazy land, right.
They say algorithms reward outrage and clickbait. So Apple's solution is basically, trust us, we're humans, we have a smell test.
And, that sounds pretty good on paper. Who wants more clickbait?
No one.
But the publisher concern documents we have, they really highlight the flaw in that logic. When you replace an algorithm with a small group of human editors, you're just swapping mathematical bias for human subjectivity.
And let's be real about who those humans are. They're mostly based in Silicon Valley and London and in New York. If all your editors live in the same 3 zip codes and run in the same circles, their definition of quality is bound to start looking like a political viewpoint.
Exactly. To someone in that cultural bubble, a story from a right-wing outlet might fail the smell test, not because it's factually wrong, but because the worldview just feels, foreign to them or low quality.
This takes me right back to the Definers public affairs scandal. Do you remember that from 2018?
Oh, I do. Yeah, that was messy.
For anyone who missed it. Back in 2018, this firm, called Definers, tried to pitch a story to journalists with this dossier claiming Apple News editors were biased. They were pointing to things like staff donations to Democrats.
And at the time, it was pretty much dismissed. It was seen as a smear campaign. The evidence was kind of weak. It was just donations, not the product itself.
But you fast forward to 2026, and this MRC study is basically saying, well, Definers might have been right, they just didn't have the data yet.
Mm-hmm.
Now we do. 96 days in a row, with not a single right-leaning story in that top spot, that pretty much validates the idea that the smell test is really an ideological filter.
And it creates this huge power imbalance. This is the publisher concern. If you're a media company, getting into Apple's top stories is like hitting the jackpot. It can completely make or break your traffic for the month.
What Apple giveth, Apple can taketh away.
Precisely. And if you're a conservative publisher, you're basically locked out of the main public square. You don't get the traffic, you don't get the ad revenue, and your stories just don't enter that mainstream conversation. All that power is consolidated in the hands of a tiny, unelected group of editors in Cupertino.
Okay, so on one hand, you have this intense gatekeeping of information. Apple is strictly policing the borders of, ideas. But, and this is the incredible contrast, when you look at their labor strategy, the gates are thrown wide open.
This is the second face of the state, the advocate.
We have to talk about the Supreme Court treaty. Apple filed an amicus brief about the DACA program, the Dreamers. And this was not your standard corporate, we support diversity letter. I read the brief. It sounds like a desperate defense of their supply chain.
But a supply chain of brains, not of parts.
That's a great way to put it. This is what they call the innovation imperative. Apple isn't just arguing for DACA on, humanitarian grounds, though that's there. They're arguing that they literally cannot function as a top tech company without these immigrants.
They use a very specific word, groupthink.
Yes. They argue that if you have a team of people who all grew up in the same suburbs, went to the same schools, look the same, you get stale ideas, you get major blind spots.
And in tech, a blind spot can be fatal. I mean, if you're designing a health monitor that needs to work on every skin tone or a translation app that gets cultural nuance, you need people from those backgrounds building the thing.
The brief actually tells stories about specific employees. It really humanizes the data. There was the story of Dio. That's how he's
identified. For engineer. Right.
He grew up seeing his mom work in the fields, just brutal manual labor. And the brief argues that seeing that struggle gave him this specific kind of drive. He taught himself to code to get his family out of that life. And Apple basically says that grit is a competitive advantage for them.
Then there was LD, the retail trainer. She uses her experience as an immigrant to connect with customers who don't speak English well. She became a top-rated employee because she had this empathy that, you can't really teach. You have to have lived it.
So Apple is essentially telling the Supreme Court, look, these 443 Dreamers we employ are not liabilities, they are assets. We literally need them to win.
It's a really bold stance, and it lines up with Tim Cook's public image. We all saw that all-hands meeting in February where he got pretty emotional. He told the whole company he was deeply distraught about the new administration's immigration policies.
He promised to fight for them. He basically said, I will stand between you and the government.
Which is what makes the next document in our stack so jarring.
The realpolitik. Because for all that talk about protection, all that talk about grit and values, Apple did something that seems to just completely contradict everything they said.
The removal of the ICEBlock app.
Let's break this down. So in October 2025, there was this app, ICEBlock. It was basically like Waze, but for avoiding deportation. Users could flag locations where they saw ICE agents, immigration and customs enforcement, so that undocumented people could avoid those areas.
It was a survival tool. I mean, if you're one of those employees that Tim Cook is deeply distraught about, this is an app you might use to just feel safe enough to leave your house.
But then the Department of Justice gets involved. Attorney General Pam Bondi sent a request to take the app down. She argued it was endangering law enforcement officers.
And this is the moment of truth, right? You have the innovation imperative on one side, protect your people, and you have state pressure on the other.
And Apple folded. They pulled the app. The creator, a guy named Joshua Aaron, he tried to fight it. He said it was just information, it's free speech. But Apple just cited safety risks and complied with the DOJ.
It feels like a total betrayal of the values in that amicus brief, doesn't it? But this is where we have to look at that academic paper in our source stack. It offers a theory that explains this whole contradiction perfectly.
Signing to signal. I love this concept. It introduces this term, mimetic isomorphism.
It's a mouthful, for sure.
Yeah.
But the idea is actually pretty simple. It just means copying to survive.
So peer pressure.
Yeah, in a way. The theory suggests that companies get involved in activism like signing letters for DACA because their peers are doing it. In Silicon Valley, supporting Dreamers is the norm. It's what your employees expect. It's what your customers expect. It's what you could call safe activism.
So when Apple goes to bat for DACA, They're signaling to the market, hey, we're one of the good guys.
Yes.
We hold the correct values.
Exactly. It's great for their reputation with their core demographic. The cost of filing a brief is low. The social reward is high. It's mimetic isomorphism. They're just mimicking the correct corporate behavior of their peers.
But the ICEBlock app, that's a whole different ballgame.
Completely different. There's no peer safety in that situation. The pressure wasn't coming from other tech companies. It was coming directly from the White House and the DOJ.
And this is where the threat of tariffs comes in. We have to remember the context here. The administration is using tariffs as just a blunt instrument. Apple's entire business model relies on a global supply chain. If the Trump administration slaps a 20% tariff on electronics, Apple's stock just tanks.
So they have to make a calculation. A very cold, hard calculation. They already adjusted their manufacturing to use more U.S. aluminum. That was a concession. They invested in U.S. supply chains. Another concession. And removing the ICEBlock app.
That was probably just one more concession. They traded the pawn to save the queen.
That's the real politic of it. They signal virtue where it's cheap and it aligns with their brand, like the DACA brief. But they comply with the state where the cost is high, like with tariffs and DOJ requests. They're constantly balancing their reputation against government regulation.
It really does solidify that nation-state metaphor we started with.
It absolutely does. I mean, think about the three branches we've talked about. They have a Ministry of Information, which is Apple News, that curates reality and filters out dissenting views to maintain order.
They have their own citizenry, their employees, the dreamers, who they advocate for and try to protect, because that citizenry is what generates their wealth and their innovation.
But at the end of the day, they're a state operating inside a larger, more powerful state. They have to negotiate treaties with the Trump administration. They can't just do whatever they want. When the actual government puts a financial squeeze on them, Apple has to bend the knee.
Which creates this really fascinating duality to the public, to the citizens of Apple. Tim Cook is this benevolent leader fighting for justice. But in the back rooms, with the attorney general and the trade reps, he's a pragmatist just making deals to keep the factories running.
And that, I think, is the lesson for you, for the listener. Apple isn't a charity. It's not a political party. It's an organism that's just trying to survive. And sometimes survival looks like courage, like the DACA brief. And other times it looks like cowardice, like banning ICEBlock or silencing conservative news. But it is always, always about the bottom line.
I just want to circle back to one last thought before we go.
Yeah.
It's something that's been bugging me since we looked at that news data.
Go for it.
So Apple argues really passionately in that Supreme Court brief that diversity of background is essential. They say, we need people who grew up differently to build better technology. They say homogeneity is dangerous.
Groupthink.
Right. They are terrified of groupthink in their engineering department.
Yeah.
But then you look at that newsroom. You look at that 100% lockout of right-leaning sources, and it really seems like they are perfectly comfortable with groupthink in their editorial department.
That's the contradiction, isn't it? Why is a diverse engineering team a must-have for innovation, but a diverse newsfeed is written off as crazy land?
It suggests they value diversity of identity, but they might just fear diversity of ideology.
And when you're the one deciding what millions of people read every single morning, that fear distorts reality for everyone.
And that's the thought we want to leave you with today. When you tap on that red icon tomorrow morning, just remember, you aren't seeing the world. You're seeing a world, one that's been very carefully built, filtered, and negotiated.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Stay curious.